It's always particularly meaningful for me to speak about faith in a college setting because when I showed up at college, if I'm honest, I thought that Christianity was for people who didn't think hard enough. I thought that faith had to be blind. I was studying philosophy at the time, and therefore I wasn't interested in it. It was important to me to use my brain at a high level. I met some Christians who challenged me to at least look into the Christian faith before I made a firm decision about it. Given how much was at stake, I began to do that. I began to read through the Bible, the New Testament, for the first time in my life. But if I'm honest, I was trying to disprove it. And so I would cross things out, and I would add things in the margin. And I'd actually write a big BS in the margins wherever I disagreed. And Christians would sort of look over my shoulder and say, "Vince, why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible?" And I'd say, "Oh, that verse makes for a great Bible study." That was my starting point. But as I continued reading, things began to change quite quickly. First, because I found myself in such admiration for this person of Jesus, the life that he lived, the way he treated people on the margins of society, the wisdom that he taught with. As I continued reading, I came to realize that the Bible wasn't asking me to put my brain on the side. It was asking me to love God with all of my mind. I didn't expect it to say that. I came to believe that Christianity could make sense not only down here, but also up here as well. And yet I also found that Christianity was being looked into by academic scholars at a very high level. And people were pursuing these questions of God, the difficult questions of God, with relentless rigor in philosophy and many other disciplines, and they were still coming to the conclusion that God exists. But I still had questions, and I still had objections, and our question for today was one of my big ones. How could there be a loving God if the world is so full of evil and suffering? I think it's a fair question. God is supposed to be all-powerful. If he's all-powerful, then he has the power to stop suffering. He's supposed to be all-loving. If he's all-loving, then he would desire to stop suffering. And yet, our world is filled with all sorts of horrendous evil and suffering. Now, if you or I stood by and watched serious suffering when we could stop it, other people would rightly call us evil. So how then can I stand up here and call God loving? That's what in philosophy is often referred to as the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. Now, some of my reflections on this topic began with a conversation I had with my Aunt Regina a number of years ago at Christmas. And she began to talk to me about how difficult it was for her to see her son, my cousin Charles, struggle with some serious suffering because of a disability that he had. And at the time, I think I was more interested in the question than the questioner. And I listened, and then I quickly responded with some of my sort of abstract philosophical explanations for why God might allow certain types of evil and suffering. And my Aunt Regina listened to me very graciously, and then she turned to me and she said, "But Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother." Explanations were not what my aunt needed at that point. She needed someone to just listen to her and appreciate what she was dealing with and be there to cry for her and with her and to care for her. Now, I am going to offer a few at least partial responses or explanations in response to this question today. But at the start, I want to recognize that in a room this big with this many people in it, there are going to be some people who are here today who are going through serious suffering right now. And actually what you need is not an explanation, but actually just someone who's willing to listen and willing to understand. And if that is the case, I hope very deeply that nothing I say will come across as offensive or insensitive to what you're going through. And Joe and I'm sure the same for Pastor David and Lydia and others. We won't rush away at the end of this event, and we'd count it a real privilege to talk with anyone who wants to talk about anything that you might be going through. Okay. To find a first, at least partial Christian response to this question, this challenge, I think I need to say something about free will. Because the Bible starts with a story of people who were created free. And it suggests that so much of the suffering that we see in this world comes down to our misuse of free will. Now, that might seem like an exaggeration to you. I think that it used to me, and it doesn't anymore. There was a moment where this shifted for me, and it had to do with the fact that when I was a teenager, there was a boy named Ewan who I used to fight with. He wasn't a very nice kid. I wasn't a very nice kid either. And I can remember taking every opportunity I could to put him down. I used the very same free will that God gave me to help him up. I used it to push him down. A number of years ago, I found out that Ewan had taken his life. And there's a place in the Bible where it says, "For the wages of sin is death." And I had read that hundreds of times probably before I heard this news, and never had it really struck home the way it did on that day. And all of a sudden I started asking myself some questions. Would he have taken his life? Had I been kind to him? Had I offered my hand to him rather than using it to push him down? And I didn't know the answer to those questions. Sometimes when I try to explain this Christian idea of sin to people, this idea that we do things wrong and that it has serious consequences, sometimes people want to tell me that I'm exaggerating, that really I'm pretty good. It's not like I've killed anyone. And the reality is that actually it's a lot harder for me to answer that question than you might expect. I think that when we reflect on our lives, and not just the things that maybe we do wrong on a day-to-day basis, but the potential rippling effects of those things, then all of a sudden we can see something of the seriousness of free will and our responsibility to use it well. Now, I do think that God could have just forced me to do the right thing. I think he's powerful enough to just program me as a robot so that I would never have caused suffering in Ewan's life or in anyone else's life. But what do we call a relationship where a more powerful person forces a less powerful person to do whatever they want them to do? We tend to call that abuse or slavery. And I don't think that's the way that you treat someone you love. I believe that God hates suffering. I don't think that it's what he wants. However, I also think that he's absolutely committed to not treating us as slaves. The Christian God is not a tyrant. Okay? A tyrant just wants obedience. He doesn't care how he gets it. The Christian God is a father. He's referred to as a loving father hundreds of times throughout the Bible. And a father wants his children to freely love him and to freely love each other. And so as a starting point, I think if we're going to consider this question honestly of why there would be suffering in the world, we have to be willing to ask it not only of God, but also of ourselves. We need to be humble enough to respond as G.K. Chesterton once did when he was asked by a newspaper to respond to the question, "What is wrong with the world?" And he wrote in a very short response. He said, "Dear sirs, I am sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton." The next response that I'd like to say something about, it centers on the following observation. We're not that smart. Sometimes I forget what I'm saying right in the middle of saying it. Sometimes I forget what I'm saying right in the middle of saying it. Always a risky one, but sometimes you just need to go for it. Sometimes I forget to do the dishes within seconds of my wife Jo telling me to. One of the assumptions that is smuggled into the thought that suffering disproves the existence of God is this assumption. If God has good reasons for allowing suffering, we should expect to know what those reasons are. But I want to ask the question, why think that? When I take my dog Buster to the vet, Buster doesn't understand why he has to experience the pain of a needle. And if I sit Buster down on the couch and try to explain to him that this needle is important so that he doesn't get a terrible disease, I don't get very far. And that's not because of some lack of ability on my part. It's not that I'm not a good enough communicator. Buster simply isn't the sort of being who can understand some of the reasons I have for some of the things that I do. And you can see the analogy. My ways are higher than Buster's ways? Why then should we be surprised if sometimes God's ways are much higher than our ways? Why should we be surprised if some of God's reasons are far beyond what we can currently grasp? There's a large and growing philosophical literature on this idea. Its technical name, if you want to look it up, is skeptical theism. But at its base, at its foundation, it's not a new idea. We find it in different places in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Or as God inquired of Job in the book of Job, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Now, personally, my experience of universe creation is zero. So I want to be at least a bit slow and cautious before I think that I'm in position to tell God how he should have created the universe. I think Pastor Tim Keller puts this really well. He says, if you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering in the world, then you have at the same moment a God great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing it to continue that you can't know. Indeed, you can't have it both ways. Do we have a full understanding of why God allows suffering? I think the answer is no. But if God is as big as a Christian thinks that he is, then perhaps that's exactly what we should expect to find, because his ways are sometimes above our ways. And if it's exactly what we should expect to find if God does exist, then the fact that we find it can't be strong evidence that he doesn't exist. I have a couple more thoughts I'd like to share with you, and I'd like to do so by telling you a few of my favorite stories. So first, a true story. My mom and dad met when they were teenagers. They both worked in a supermarket, my dad stocking the shelves and my mom as a cashier. And my mom says that she would call for price checks when she didn't need them so that she'd get to flirt with my dad. She says that he had great shoulders. Anyway, on their first date, they went to a black tie event in New York City on New Year's Eve, and they fell in love. On their second date, they were standing on the Brooklyn Bridge. They were overlooking the picturesque New York City skyline, and my dad noticed a ring on my mom's finger. So he asked about it, and she said, "Oh, that's just some ring one of my old boyfriends gave to me. I just wear it because I think it looks nice." And my dad said, "Oh yeah, it is nice. Let me see it." And so she took off the ring, and she handed it to my dad. And my dad, he hurled it off the bridge, and he watched it sink to the bottom of the East River. And he said, "You're with me now. You won't be needing that anymore." And my mom loved it. I think it was sort of the clinching moment for them. It tells you something about my family. How is this relevant to the problem or the question of suffering? Well, it's typical to think of the challenge of suffering like this. We picture ourselves in this world with all of its suffering. Then we picture ourselves in a very different world with no suffering or far less suffering. And then we say to ourselves, surely God should have created me in the other world, in the world with far less suffering or no suffering. And that's a reasonable thought. However, I think there's a question that we forget to ask. We forget to ask the question, would it still be you and me as the individuals that we are, and would it still be the people sitting next to you and the people that you love if actually the world that existed was that very different world that included far less suffering or no suffering at all? I think that's a difficult question. You see, it was a pretty risky move my dad made when he hurled my mom's ring off the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, she loved it, but what if she hadn't? What if she had concluded, this guy's crazy, I better run back with the old boyfriend instead? What would that have meant for me? Now, I don't know who that old boyfriend was. In fact, if you can believe it, 50 years later, my dad still tries to get my mom to tell him who the old boyfriend was, and she still flatly refuses to say. I think she's worried he's going to pay him a visit or something. But let's suppose it's about the right generation. Let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that mom's old boyfriend had been Sylvester Stallone. Now, you have to admit, in some ways, it would be a positive to have Sylvester as a dad. I doubt I would have had to worry about being bullied at school if my dad was both Rocky and Rambo. However, there's one problem with wishing that things had worked out between my mom and her old boyfriend. I never would have existed. Perhaps some other child would have existed, and maybe that child wouldn't have had to worry about getting bullied at school. But part of what makes me who I am, not everything, but part of what makes me who I am, is my beginning, the specific individual that I am, the parents that I have, the sperm and egg that I came from, the combination of genes that's true of me. I'm sure my mom and Sylvester, or whoever her old boyfriend was, would have had some very nice kids. But I'm not so sure that I would have been one of them. We often very understandably wish that we could take some specific piece of suffering out of the world while keeping everything else the same. But I'm not sure that it works that way. If something as small as the throwing of a ring into a river can change who comes to exist, imagine how radically who comes to exist would be changed if God miraculously removed all vulnerability to suffering. Imagine if he took away free will every time we thought to hurt someone. Or imagine if he radically changed our natural environment, if weather systems or plate tectonics didn't behave as they do, if we were never susceptible to disease, if the laws of thermodynamics had undergone a redesign. What would be the results? And I wonder if one of the results is that none of us and none of the people that we love would have lived. Sometimes we understandably wish for a very different world, but in doing so, without realizing it, it may be that we actually wish ourselves right out of existence. And here's the thing. I don't think God likes that idea. In fact, I think one of the things that God values most about this world, even though I think he hates the suffering within it, is that it is a world that allowed for you to come to exist. I believe he desired you and the person sitting next to you and every person that you see walking down the street. Now, sometimes when I say that idea to people, they respond with the question, well, why me? Why us? Why would God choose to create us if he could have created more impressive beings that maybe would have been less prone to suffering? And it's a good question. Actually, it's a biblical question. Psalm 8 says, what are mere mortals that you should think about them? Human beings that you should care for them? And I think there's a one-word answer to that question, and it's my favorite word, and I think it's a word that is most true in the Christian faith, and that word is grace, or unmerited love. The philosopher Robert Adams puts it this way. He says, grace is a disposition to love which is not dependent on the merit of the person loved. A gracious person sees what is valuable in the person he loves and does not worry about whether it is more or less valuable than what could be found in someone else he might have loved. Early in our dating relationship, there was a moment where Jo turned to me. I think she was a bit blinded by love and probably fishing for a few compliments. And she turned to me and she said, Vince, I don't deserve you. And I turned to her and said, no, you don't. Not recommended. And thankfully, I didn't stop there. I said, no, you don't, and I don't deserve you either. Isn't it wonderful? How could we ever deserve another person as our very own? I mean, surely that's beyond what any of us could ever deserve. I think, and Christianity says, that the best forms of love are not about what we earn or merit or deserve. It is based on grace. And I really like that type of love. It's the sort of love that means you don't always have to be looking over your shoulder, wondering and worrying about whether someone more worthy of love than you is going to come along. It's a love that is secure. And therefore, it's a love that you can stop competing for and just start to enjoy. I wonder how you would answer that question. Do you compete for love, or do you rest in the security of knowing that you can enjoy it? What if, even before the foundation of the world, God loved us with this grace type of love, this unmerited type of love, with love that is a gift, with love that is exactly the same on your best day and on your very worst day, with love that you cannot lose, nothing you could do to lose it. With the love of a parent standing over a newborn child, there is nothing that newborn child can do to earn the parent's love. And yet the parent's love could not be more extravagant for that child. The question, why do you love the child? It doesn't even make sense to the parent. What do you mean? That's my child. I created him or her. They have my nose. It's just that extravagant, unmerited grace type of love. Love that is not to be earned, but simply to be returned. What if God loves us like that? My family has had quite a bit of disability in it, and it's caused some serious suffering. Now, some people would say that because of his disability, it would have been better if my cousin Charles had never existed. After all, there would have been less suffering in the world overall. Okay, I strongly disagree with that. Like my Aunt Regina, it's because I knew Charles intimately that his suffering caused such frustration. But it's also because I knew Charles intimately that I could understand why God would love him so much and why God might be attracted to creating a world that would allow for Charles to come to exist. And so the problem of suffering, it's reframed in the form of a question. Could God have wronged us by creating a world in which we came to exist and are offered eternal life, rather than creating a very different world in which we never would have lived? There's a strong analogy here between divine creation on the one hand and human procreation or having a child on the other. When parents decide to have a child, they actually risk a lot of suffering. We don't tend to think about it that way, and rightfully so. We want to focus on the positive and the hopeful aspects of procreation, and I totally get that. But there's still a reality to the fact that in having a child, we are doing something that we know will result in the serious suffering of another person. Because even the most fortunate of human lives includes some serious suffering. And even more than that, we know that one day, any child that we bring into existence will actually suffer death. I know that's a really sobering thought, and I hesitate to even say it. But it suggests that this objection from suffering is more complicated than it first appears. If someone thinks it would be evil to create people into a world that you know will produce serious suffering in their lives, which at first glance looks like a pretty reasonable statement, but if you accept that claim, you will not only need to call God evil, you will actually need to call evil anyone who decides to have a child. And I think it's interesting how quick we are to look up and blame God, how quick we are to hold God to a standard that perhaps we don't even hold ourselves to, how quick we are to look up and blame God, the same God who, when he suffered on a cross at our hands, at human hands, his instinct was actually to look down and to say, Father, forgive them. I'm going to return to my parents' story. And it's important to note that when my parents were deciding to have me, it wasn't just potential suffering in their lives they had to consider. They also had to consider, not just in my life, they also had to consider what it would cost them to have me and to raise me. Love requires sacrifice. So my parents decided to have me, they did, and then my mom sacrificed countless hours of sleep to care for me. In fact, when I was an infant, apparently I wouldn't go to sleep unless my mom was holding my hand, and so rather than probably doing what she should have done and let me cry it out, she pulled a mattress into my room and slept night after night on this uncomfortable mattress with her hand stretched up into my crib so that I could hold her hand. Now, eventually we got past that stage. That wasn't a joke. We got past that stage, and then I was about 6 years old, and I was playing football on my best friend, my next-door neighbor's front lawn. And I was getting knocked around pretty good. And I started crying, and then I came running home to my mom, who was actually out on the porch. And I came running up to the porch. There's Mom, sporting the classic 80s onesie. Yeah, some of you had those. And I came running up to my mom, and I was crying, and I was saying, I'm not tough enough. I'm not tough enough. I was playing with some older kids. I was getting knocked around, and I was crying, and I was saying, I'm not tough enough. So what did my mom do? My mom did what any loving mother of a 6-year-old son would do. She positioned herself like this. She got in quite an athletic stance, and she hung her nose out in the air, She looked at me lovingly, and then she said, "Punch me in the nose. You are tough enough. Punch me in the nose." And at first I know what you're thinking, crazy Italians, right? And at first I just looked at her like she was crazy, and indeed she was. But true story, my mom persisted. She said, "Punch me in the nose. You are tough enough. Punch me in the nose." And I don't know what sort of psychological state I must have been in, but finally I did. I reared back and I gave my mom a straight right hand to the nose. And to my astonishment and to her astonishment, blood actually began to trickle out of my mom's nose and down her face. Learning a lot about my family. Then came one of the most vivid and just gorgeous images from my childhood. Through this blood that was coming down my mom's face just came the most dazzling, just radiant and joyful smile. And my mom said, "Now get back out there." And my mom sent me back out into that game, and she went inside to get cleaned up. You might not know what to make of that story. Understandably so. What a bizarre thing for my mom to do. What an unthinkable, messy, bloody thing to do. But I also think, in at least one sense, what an extravagant display of love. My mom chose to bring me into this world, and she knew that there would be suffering. But that in itself did not make her evil. Why not? Because when that suffering came and my eyes filled with tears, she bent down into that suffering with me, even though that meant suffering at the hands of her own child. And I think that is a picture for a Christian of Jesus on the cross, where God did something unthinkable and messy and bloody, where God bent down and stepped into our suffering with us, even though that meant suffering at the hands of those he had created. The night before Jesus died, as he wrestled with what he knew the next day would bring, he said to some of his friends, he said, "My heart is overwhelmed with sorrow, even to the point of death." It's an amazing statement. The God of the universe, the creator of all things, saying he is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. If you've ever experienced deep depression, if you've ever thought about suicide, there is no depth of agony or helplessness that you can experience in this life that Jesus doesn't understand. The loving parent is not the one who never allows suffering in a child's life. The loving parent is the one who is willing to suffer alongside their children. The loving parent is the one who is willing to make a personal sacrifice, to do whatever it takes to see their children through suffering. Ironically, I think it may be the famous atheist Friedrich Nietzsche who says it best. He said, "The gods justified human life by living it themselves, the only satisfactory response to the problem of suffering ever invented." Nietzsche is actually writing of the ancient Greeks here, and he doesn't seem to make the connection to Christianity. But I think that the connection is clear. At the cross, we see the absolute uniqueness of the Christian response to suffering, because only in Jesus do we find a God who is loving enough to come and suffering beside us, to make sure that we never suffer alone. So far, I've been considering whether God can be good and loving despite the existence of suffering. But as I start to draw to a close, I also want to recognize that that's not the only problem of suffering. There's also the problem of how are we going to deal with suffering in life? And that's a challenge or a problem for every one of us, regardless of what we do or don't believe about God. My cousin Charles died a few years ago. He went to dinner with my Aunt Regina. He started choking on a piece of food. They couldn't get him to start breathing again. And a few minutes later, that was it. I mean, that's how fragile life can be. But I think that Christianity offers a much better hope. 2 years ago, one of my students named Ariel, 23 years old, got diagnosed with a cavernoma a cluster of cells in her brain that's prone to bleeding, and she was told that she probably only had a couple of years left to live. And a few days later, after this diagnosis, she told me that there was a point at which she found herself standing in front of the mirror, and she was testing the limited mobility that she had on her right side. And the questions that popped into her head were, is this the strongest I'm ever going to be? Is this the healthiest I'm ever going to be? Is this the prettiest I'm ever going to be? And then she told me of the amazing peacefulness and the joy that came over her when she remembered the answers to those questions. No, absolutely not. There will come a day where her body will be able to do far more than it's ever done before. And I remembered in that instance that she loved to snowboard. So I said to her, do you think that there will be snowboarding in heaven? And I wish you could have been there to see how confidently and how unhesitatingly she said, absolutely. She said, and soccer as well. Every one of us will have to deal with significant suffering in our lives, regardless of what we do or don't believe about God. And so when suffering comes, when death comes, who will be there to bear it with us, and who will be there to see us through it? I believe that before time, God chose my cousin Charles because he wanted to give him life and he wanted to invite him into relationship with himself. I believe that in time, God loved Charles enough to suffer alongside him, and I believe at the end of time that God will set things right. I believe in the most tangible sense that I'm going to see my cousin Charles again. I'm going to see him in a place that the Bible describes as where God himself will wipe every tear from our eyes, where there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. It's a beautiful detail in that passage that he will wipe every tear from their eyes. Not just that there won't be tears, but that God will literally, physically, in that intimacy of relationship, wipe the tears from our eyes. It's an invitation into relationship, with the one who created you, with the one who knows you best, and with the one who loves you best in that unconditional way, not because of anything you've merited, but just because of who you are, created in his image. Well, that is, I think, the hope of the Christian faith. I think that is the hope and the promise of the person of Jesus in the midst of suffering. Thank you for giving me a hearing, allowing me to commend that hope to you this afternoon. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Jo, and I hope you are as well. Come join us, Jo.
Well, good afternoon. It's really, really good to be here with you today. I know my accent comes as a bit of a shock after listening to Vince. Hopefully I won't lull you all to sleep. If you have any translation problems, just let me know and we can get him back up here to translate into Italian American for you. But like Vince, when I look at the person of Jesus Christ, I too find myself astonished by the God that I encounter, a God who cares deeply about my suffering and who is committed to doing something about it. But one question that you may still find yourself troubled by, however, is what about when God appears to be the cause of our suffering? And you certainly wouldn't be alone in asking that question. In fact, far from looking to the Bible for our morality, these days we live in a culture that accuses the God of the Bible of immorality. Leading the charge is, of course, Richard Dawkins, who in true understated British fashion puts it this way: the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Tell us how you really feel, Richard. If we want proof text for Dawkins' view here, then actually we don't need to look far. We can turn to Deuteronomy chapter 20, which tells us, in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes. Or what about Leviticus chapter 25? As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. What about Deuteronomy 21? When you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and you're attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. What are we to make of shocking texts like these that we find in the Bible? How can this be the same God that said that every person is created in his image and therefore equal before him? Or how can this be the same God who is Jesus, the Jesus who tells us to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us? How can this be reconciled with the fact that in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul calls his slaves brothers and says there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free? These protests against the morality of the God of the Bible are absolutely crucial because the Christian God is supposed to be the same yesterday, today, and forever. So if we can't demonstrate that God has been good in the past, how can we trust him with today, let alone forever? Now, with the rest of our time together, I'm going to take a closer look specifically at these three examples of how the God of the Bible treats foreigners, slaves, and women. But before we do that, it's absolutely crucial to bear in mind that when it comes to reading the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, we need to be so careful not to leap to conclusions. Now, this was something I learned for myself the first time I went to stay with my Italian-American in-laws in New Jersey, and I was sitting out on the back deck with Vince's great Uncle Big, and yes, he really is called Uncle Big, when we heard raised voices coming from inside the house. And so I looked back through the window to see Vince and his mum in the middle of what looked like a screaming match. They were both bright red in the face, their noses were about 1 inch away from each other, and their arms were gesticulating wildly. And what made the whole thing even more terrifying was that Vince's mum had been chopping garlic with this huge kitchen knife. And so she was kind of flailing this thing around, and every so often when she really wanted to make a big point, she would just poke it right in Vince's face. And so I'm there thinking, oh my goodness, World War III has broken out, and I'm going to have to run in and break this thing up, and I'm going to get skewered myself in the process. Now, thankfully, things calmed down, and Vince wandered away, so I went to find him because I wanted to know if everything was going to be okay. And so I went up to him and I said, hey, are things all right with your mum? And Vince just looked at me, confused, and he had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. And he explained to me that he and his mum were just having a perfectly enjoyable conversation. And so I said, well, what about the raised voices and the hands and the knife waving? And he just laughed and said, Jo, that's just how Italian Americans talk to each other. And I couldn't believe how badly I'd interpreted the situation. What looked to me like a knife fight was in fact two Italian Americans just telling each other that they love each other. And I actually couldn't believe how wrong I could read this situation. It really shocked me because I'm actually somebody who had grown up watching American TV. I'm used to traveling to other countries, and I even speak the same language, well, supposedly anyway. But I could still so badly misinterpret another culture. Now, my point is this. If I had that much trouble understanding and interpreting Italian Americans living in New Jersey in the 21st century, then how much more challenging should I expect to find understanding and interpreting ancient Near Eastern cultures from around 3,000 years ago? When we step into the Old Testament, we're actually stepping into a wildly different world. And so we shouldn't be surprised that we need to work hard to understand the culture and the context of the text that we are reading. But when we do, when we take the time to understand them, then they begin to make so much more sense. Consider, for example, Richard Dawkins' accusation that through the Israelite conquest of Canaan, God shows himself to be a racist, genocidal tyrant and ethnic cleanser. Now, Dawkins' accusation jars strongly with the overarching vision of a biblical narrative that although we live in a broken world now, we look forward to a future where we will live at peace. As the prophet Isaiah puts it, to a time when swords will be beaten into plowshares and there will be no more war. Looking forward towards that time, God promises Abraham that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And this is how God commanded the Israelites to live out that promise. He says, the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Now, it is, of course, true that as a last resort for dealing with the bloody, brutal cultures which surrounded ancient Israel, we do find instructions for warfare in the Old Testament. But I wonder if Dawkins knows that while the standard practice in ancient warfare was to rape captive women, the Israelites were prohibited from this. And while other tribes frequently attacked the Israelites without warning, the Israelites were commanded by God to offer their opponents the chance to surrender peacefully. And although in other nations men were forcefully conscripted into the military, in Israel, men were excused from fighting if they were recently married, if they just built a new house, or if they simply didn't want to. It was also common practice in the ancient world to treat conquered victims with absolute ruthlessness and extreme forms of torture. And yet, in contrast to this, in Deuteronomy 20, God actually commands the Israelites to show mercy by leaving behind the fruit on the trees, which means that any survivors who were left in the land wouldn't starve. In the messy, bloody context of the ancient world, God gave laws for warfare that were intended to protect human life as far as possible. But if that's the case, however, then what do we make of these toughest passages? Passages like Deuteronomy 20, for example, in which God commands them to kill everything that breathes. Now, first, we need to be aware that a divine command like this one, ordering such wholesale destruction, is not only rare in the Old Testament, but it's constrained by the stipulations that the Israelites are only to do this against particular people and only in the cities that the Lord is handing over to them. Now, why does that matter? Because it means that God is in no way setting a precedent here. By framing the commands with these strict historical boundaries, the Bible won't let us look back on texts like these and use them as justification for similar kinds of warfare, either in history or today. A second response worth considering has been offered by the philosopher Paul Copan, who argues that although this command to kill everything that breathes may seem shockingly comprehensive, this is actually an example of ancient hyperbole or military rhetoric. And this would be similar to the way that, as somebody who's married into a family of avid New York Yankees fans, I might say that the Yankees slaughtered the Red Sox in that game. It was total carnage. Yet when I say that, I don't literally mean that the Yankees are going to be thrown in jail for first-degree murder of the Red Sox. Rather, this is a common cultural expression, an example of the way that we use exaggerated language in our everyday speech. And likewise, Copan suggests that the Israelites are adopting a form of warfare language that was common in the ancient world. And we see evidence for this kind of rhetoric in the words of Pharaoh Ramesses II, who makes the sweeping claim that he wiped out the whole nation of Israel in the 13th century BC, as he states, Israel is wasted, his seed is no more. But of course, historically, we know that the Israelite people were not wiped out. Instead, this is an example of this kind of military language that was well known and understood in ancient culture. Now, Copan's argument for military rhetoric helps us make sense of the picture that the Bible itself presents to us. So, for example, although initially we're told in Judges chapter 10 that Joshua has fulfilled God's command to kill everything that breathes in a certain region, only a few chapters later, the Israelites go on to fight more people still living in that very same region, the region that Joshua has supposedly already killed everything that breathes. And other texts confirm the reality of the Israelite victory being less comprehensive than we might initially assume, as despite the claims to have destroyed everyone, Judges chapter 1 verse 27 clearly states that the Israelites did not drive them out completely. And in fact, even this language that is set alongside the command to kill everything that breathes, the language of driving out the Canaanites, which is used 3 times as many times as the language of killing everything that breathes, this language is further evidence that actually the fate of many of the Canaanites was exile rather than death. Now, I know that when I first began reading some of these warfare passages in the Old Testament, what upset me the most was all of the civilians that must have been killed. However, archaeological evidence also indicates that the cities the Lord hands over to the Israelites weren't major civilian cities, but instead military outposts along trade routes into Canaan, where there would have been very few non-combatants. The city of Jericho, for example, was actually a small military fort manned primarily by soldiers, small enough, in fact, for an army to march around it 7 times in one day and still go on to fight a battle. And additionally, the only civilians that we're told were present are the tavern worker Rahab and her household. And in her case, not only are their lives spared, but she even becomes part of the bloodline that leads to Christ and is counted in the New Testament as a woman of great faith. Adding up all these various pieces of both biblical and archaeological evidence, it seems that while Israel's victory may have been decisive against the Canaanites, historically it was not a war of total annihilation. Now, of course, none of this evidence takes away from the fact that God did command the Israelites to go to war against these people. And nor is there any getting around the fact that actually war is always horrendous. And I think any attempt to pretend otherwise just seems extremely callous. And yet the question that we need to ask ourselves is why? What was the motivation here? And what Scripture makes clear is that actually, far from this being a genocidal act motivated either by ethnic hatred or imperialistic greed, this was in fact a justified war, a war that God intended as an act of justice. Now, I recognize the challenge for those of us trying to explain that idea in our culture today is that we belong to a society that lives and dies by these words. No one has the right to judge me, not even God. Nor can most people get their heads around the idea of why God would even want to judge us. After all, if God is so loving, why does he go around judging people instead of just forgiving everyone? Isn't that what we've all been taught to do ever since we were children? So why then can't God practice what he preaches? You know, this is actually a question that I used to struggle with a lot until something happened one day that radically changed the way I thought about this issue. And what took place was when one of my friends went through the terrible trauma of being raped. And, you know, seeing her go through the horror of that, seeing the guilt and shame she feels for something that she has no reason to feel guilty for, and seeing the way that she would punish herself and her body by not eating, and seeing the way that she would go through one messed up relationship to another because ever since that day she can't cope with the idea of intimacy. You know, there are just no words to put on the horror of something like that, or to describe how devastated and how angry I felt towards the person who did that to her and who got away with it, and how much I cried out for justice in that situation. You know, that's when I realized if I love my friends enough that I cannot stand to see them mistreated, how much more frustrated would a God who loves every single one of us more than we can possibly imagine be over the ways that we hurt one another? You know, some of you here, you've been treated very badly, and that matters to God. It really matters to him. It's precisely because God loves each one of us so much that there must be judgment for the ways we wrong each other. If he didn't judge, he'd actually be saying he doesn't care that we've been wronged and violated and hurt. As the theologian Miroslav Volf put it after the massacre of his people in the war in former Yugoslavia, although I used to complain against the indecency of God's wrath, I came to realize I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love. You know, contrary to what our culture would have us believe, the judgment of God demonstrates rather than disproves his love for us. But even so, for many people, the severity of the judgment of Canaan through warfare, it may seem disproportionate to you. You may struggle to see the justice in it. But perhaps one reason for this is because we're not seeing the Canaanites themselves clearly. You see, when it came to the Canaanites, one of the idols they worshipped was called Baal, a god who was celebrated in Canaanite theology for raping his sister over 70 times while she took the form of a calf. And another idol they worshipped was Anat, the goddess of sex and war, who's described in Canaanite mythology as wading in blood so deep that it came up to her neck. Under her feet were human heads, above her human hands flew like locusts, her liver swelled with laughter, her heart was full of joy. No wonder then that this was a culture known for bestiality, for incest, adultery, violence, and most horrifyingly of all, for even sacrificing their own children in the fire to their gods. And archaeologists have found the charred remains of thousands of child sacrifices in the Phoenician city of Carthage who worshipped those same Canaanite gods. And yet, even in this most extreme of circumstances, God still remains slow to anger and abounding in love. This is a God who the Old Testament tells us actually holds off judgment for 400 years in the hope that the Canaanites would turn and be saved. Just as staggeringly, this is the same God who at the cross was willing to be judged himself so that he could hold off our judgment not for 400 years, but for all eternity. The Canaanite goddess Anat glories in shedding the blood of her enemies. The Christian God had his blood shed while praying for his enemies. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. But if God is so concerned about justice, then what of his attitude towards slavery? How can it be that God's own people, who were themselves a nation of freed slaves brought out of Egypt, could in turn look favorably on the owning of slaves in Israel? Slavery was the foundation upon which the empires of the ancient world were built. Aristotle lived in what was supposedly the most advanced civilization of the ancient world, and this is what he had to say. Tame animals are naturally better than wild animals. By analogy, the same must necessarily apply to mankind as a whole. It's clear there are certain people who are free and certain who are slaves by nature, and it's both to their advantage and just for them to be slaves. You see, for Aristotle, not all people are created equal. Slaves are not equal. And who would have been slaves? Primarily the poor or the foreigner. But what the Bible affirms, however, is the exact opposite of this, that no person is inferior by nature. And so actually it's an effort to care for the poor rather than to take advantage of the poor that certain forms of slavery were sometimes allowed. In ancient Israel, for example, the poor were given the right to glean the edges of the fields during harvest time so they wouldn't starve. And their fellow Israelites were prohibited from charging them interest on their loans. However, if after all of this, an individual or a family still found themselves destitute and dying, then as a last resort, they had the option of choosing to work as servants to pay off their debts. So Leviticus says they're to be treated as workers, hired from year to year. You must see to it that those to whom they owe service do not rule over them ruthlessly. Importantly, this wasn't slavery as we tend to think of it with all of our recent and horrifying cultural baggage. Rather, this was a form of voluntary indentured servitude. And nor was this a permanent situation, as every 7 years the debt would be cancelled and these servants were released regardless of whether they'd fully paid off their debts or not. And when this happened, their employers were commanded to give generously to them and to do so without a grudging heart. And significantly, even foreign slaves had the opportunity to save up sufficient means to buy back their freedom and remain as residents in the land. And on top of this, Israelites were forbidden from branding or tattooing their servants as if they were property. If they permanently injured one of them, they immediately had to set them free. And if they killed one of them, then that was considered murder, punishable by death. Now, all of this stands radically in contrast with the abusive treatment of slaves as property in the surrounding ancient Near East culture, as well as starkly contradicting many of the horrendous legal codes governing slave ownership in the 18th and 19th century antebellum era. As the Anchor Bible Dictionary summarizes, we have in the Bible the first appeals in world literature to treat slaves as human beings for their own sake and not just in the interests of their masters. Or the same conclusion in the words of Job. If I've denied justice to my men servants and maidservants when they have a grievance against me, what will I do when God confronts me? What will I answer when called to account? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one form us both within our mothers? Yes, he did. And this is the same God who in the New Testament continues to stand up for those in slavery, affirming them as our brothers and sisters and proclaiming there's no longer slave nor free. Why not? Because Jesus didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. But if God is so concerned about the oppressed and the downtrodden, then why is it that he's consistently rumored to be a misogynist? You know, a while ago in the UK, our most popular national radio program, they ran a series entitled The Misogynist Book Club, in which every week they discussed a different book that they considered to have had a significantly negative and oppressive impact on the status of women throughout history. Now, coming in at number 2 was 50 Shades of Grey. But can you guess which book beat out 50 Shades of Grey to make it to the number 1 spot as the most oppressive book in history for women? Yep, the Bible. And yet, very tellingly, in this radio show, the discussion began with Genesis chapter 2, and it skipped right over the stunning declaration in Genesis 1, right on the first page of the Bible, that men and women alike are made in the image of God and therefore have equal standing before him. You know, it can be easy to overlook how radical these words are from our 21st century perspective, but truly, there's no other statement of gender equality like this in the ancient world. Certainly to Greek culture, it was nonsense. It was Plato who said it's only males who are created directly by the gods and are given souls. Those who live rightly return to the stars, but those who are cowards may with reason be supposed to have changed into the nature of women in the second generation. According to Plato, the punishment for cowardly men is that their souls will be reborn in women. So gentlemen in the room, ye have been warned. But, you know, by contrast, however, just like with foreigners as slaves, when we take the time to dig into what the text is actually saying, the Bible continues to surprise us with its treatment of women. Look at the verse I began with. If you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and you're attracted to her, you may take her as your wife after she's lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month. Then you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you're not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. Now, I think we can all agree at first glance, this text makes for really uncomfortable reading. But what is it actually saying? Well, firstly, that rape is banned in ancient Israel. Instead, if a man desires a foreign woman, he has to wait for a month after the battle, both to ensure that he's not just driven by short-term lust, but also to allow the woman time to grieve her parents and her old way of life. And after a time, the man may then take her as his partner, but only if he commits to marrying her. And in this way, the woman is welcomed into the Israelite community as a full family member with all of the status that entails. And finally, if he doesn't wish for the marriage, then he can't sell her on like property. Instead, he must set her free. In 2014, I was horrified to read in the news the pamphlet that Islamic State had released to its soldiers, giving guidelines for the treatment of female prisoners of war. Now, the irony was that the Islamic State leaders composed this document to try and restrain the way that their soldiers were behaving towards captive Yazidi and Christian women. And yet, amongst other things, the pamphlet states that it is permissible for the soldiers to have sexual intercourse with a female captive immediately upon capture. That she need not be taken as a wife, but only as a sexual slave. That it's permissible to sell her on or give her as a gift if he doesn't want her. And most horrifyingly of all, that intercourse is permitted even if she's not yet reached puberty. You know, it was as I sat there reading that pamphlet and literally shaking that I was struck by just how unbelievably compassionate these instructions in Deuteronomy 21 actually are. That the two perspectives couldn't be more different. One is a clear case of a horrendous abuse of power, whereas even in the most hostile and impossible of circumstances, the intention of the God of the Bible is always to afford women every measure of protection possible. And this is as true in the New Testament as it is in the Old, which is really saying something, because by Jesus' day, the view of women in his era had actually become even worse. And yet this comparison only makes his own attitude towards women all the more remarkable. For example, the influence of Greek culture had led to the belief that women succumb to sexual temptation far more easily than men, and therefore to catch sight of a beautiful woman was to find yourself in grave danger. As one later Jewish law code even states, it's more dangerous to walk behind a woman than it is to walk behind a lion. Now, in that time, if a man was sexually immoral with a woman, then it wasn't the man who was blamed for crossing that line, but actually it was the woman, on account of her powers of seduction, who was said to have led him astray. And how tragic it is that 2,000 years have passed and we're still playing these same blame games in our culture today. And yet it was into this culture that Jesus preaches the Sermon on the Mount, in which he turns these cultural assumptions completely on their head when he says, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now, any man who heard Jesus speak those words would have fallen off his seat. Jesus is saying the exact opposite of what his culture taught, challenging men to recognize that actually lust originates within our own hearts and to take responsibility for it. And he calls us to a higher standard of seeing women not as sexual objects, but as human beings made in the image of God. That's just one example of many in the New Testament, because time and again, Jesus goes up against culturally oppressive attitudes towards women and he completely overturns them. Which is why I find it really sad when I meet women all the time who've been put off Christianity by the rumor that the Bible is bad news for women. Because personally, I've never met anyone like Jesus, someone who brings out the best in me, someone who loves me more than I could love myself. This is exactly the kind of man that I want to spend time with, and exactly the kind of God that it is a privilege to worship. And another woman who felt this way about the God of the Bible was Hagar, who we read about in Genesis 16. Now, by ancient standards, Hagar is nobody. She's female, she's a slave, she's a foreigner, she's the full trifecta, if you will. By every measure of ancient society, she's counted as worthless. And yet when Hagar flees from an abusive situation in her home and into the desert, something completely unexpected happens to her. You know, it's exceptionally rare in the Old Testament for anyone to experience a supernatural encounter with God. And yet of all people that God could have chosen to reveal himself to, he chose Hagar. And at the very lowest point of her life, when Hagar has lost hope, God reaches out to her in a deeply personal way. And in response, Hagar gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." And she said, "I've now seen the one who sees me." Last year, I was taking part in some events over at UC Berkeley, and I happened to be there giving a talk on International Women's Day. Now, as you can imagine, at UC Berkeley, International Women's Day is a pretty hectic day in the calendar, and all over campus that day, there were lots of women out protesting with banners and signs and yelling and shouting, and just there was a general feeling of anger on campus. But you know, right in the middle of this crazy scene on the busiest thoroughfare of the university, there stood a woman. And she was there in fishnet tights and a really short skirt, and she was topless, and she had a paper bag over her head with just the eyes cut out. And you could tell that people didn't really know what to make of this very public scene. Some people sort of laughed, I guess out of discomfort, they were just shocked, and other people immediately turned their eyes away and they just hurried on by. But if you got close enough to her, then you could see written across the paper bag were these words: "All 5 of my rapists are getting away with it." And then you looked into her eyes and they were just completely haunted, and your own heart just broke. But you know, as horrifying
as that moment was to see someone in that kind of pain, I have to say I've also never felt more convinced that only the God of the Bible could offer her the hope that she so desperately needed. To know that even though human justice had failed her, that divine justice wouldn't, because there's a God whose unshakable commitment to both love and justice run right through from the Old to the New Testament, that from beginning to end, the judge of all the earth will do what is right. And yet at the very same time, the unfading love of God also means that no matter how defaced or dehumanized she's been made to feel, no matter what kind of bag or mask she might wear over her head, that there is a God who sees right to the heart of her, who looks on her with such compassion in her harassed and helpless state that in Christ he chose to be identified with her, to be stripped naked and exposed like her, to undergo public humiliation and ridicule, to become one from whom men hide their faces, to know what it's like to wear nothing but shame and to endure unimaginable violence, suffering, and isolation, all because he couldn't bear to stand by and watch from a distance. Instead, out of love, he came right alongside, suffering with her and for her. You know, that day in Berkeley, one of my teammates, when she saw her, she felt this overwhelming feeling of God saying to her, out of everybody here on this campus today, I identify with her. I'm here for her. And so my friend went up to her and she began to share some of the things I've just shared with you. And as she did, the girl just started to cry. And then she threw her arms around my friend and they just stood there holding each other in the middle of that public square while everybody else passed on by wondering what on earth was going on. But you see, that was the day that that woman discovered, just like Hagar, that there's a living God who looks on her with love and who doesn't see a foreign, enslaved, oppressed, unworthy woman. He simply sees his beloved child. We live in an age where around every corner, people are buying into the rumors about the Bible's oppression, immorality, and unfaithfulness. And yet the more I study Scripture, the more thankful I am that the God of the Bible is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Far from being a God of injustice, time and again, when I open the book, I encounter a God of radical love for every single person, a God who doesn't overlook our suffering, but of whom I can gratefully say, I have now seen the one who sees me. Thank you so much for listening.